All right, hello. Welcome to another session of Beyond Talks. I guess that's what we call it nowadays. So today we are talking about this new critical vulnerability in Microsoft's MFA implementation. I think this is now just being referred to as the AuthQuake exploit. So my name is Jing, I lead product marketing here. With me is Stephen. He's probably a familiar face to a lot of you. Stephen is our senior solutions engineer who knows the ins and outs of authentication, probably better than the back of your hand, but maybe you stare at your hand very much. I don't know. So yeah, let's talk about it. I guess to start, can you share a little bit more information about what exactly this vulnerability entails?
Sure. This wasn't a particularly sophisticated vulnerability, to be honest with you. This really goes back to a form of a brute force attack when it really comes down to it. So we talked about brute force attacks with things like symmetric credentials, like passwords, for a long time. This is just a bit different, where there was a brute force attack against time-based one-time passwords. Time-based one-time passwords are what we commonly know as a weak form of multi-factor authentication, and unfortunately, a lot of solutions are still using as a means to provide a step-up authentication. And in this case, basically, they were able to be exploited, much like a brute force password attack would be. So that's really what the anatomy of it comes down to. And we'll talk a little bit about sliding windows and how Oasis Security was able to manipulate some things like time zones and rate limiting and things like that. So there was a little bit more that went into it, but really, Jane, it just comes back to what we preach quite a bit is to not use phishable credentials, to use hardware-backed cryptographic keys. And that's really what this comes down to.
Oh my goodness, you make it sound so easy. It's not even sophisticated. The Oasis security research team is weeping right now. I'm just kidding.
Well,
This
I
is
give them credit. They gave it a cool name, didn't they?
they did.
AuthQuake.
It's really good. Yeah. Next thing we know, we're going to start assigning those. You know how they measure earthquakes, like 4.5 or like
Yeah,
8.7. Start
on a Richter
measuring
scale.
places. Yeah. I grew up in California. I can't believe I didn't remember that. Okay, so how did Microsoft respond to this? This vulnerability, it's disclosed. What do they do about it to secure their customers? Oh, there goes your earbuds.
Yeah, luckily I made the catch there. So luckily for Microsoft in this particular case, this was an ethical reported attack by Oasis Security. It wasn't something that necessarily affected their customers, as far as we know, right? A lot of times these things happen, and we don't really know if this actually kind of happened to any customers or who was affected. We just don't hear about it in the news. But anyhow, the way that Microsoft essentially responded to this was to put a few more parameters around these time-based one-time passwords, making the length in which they can be used shorter, rate limiting them. Again, this is a brute force attack, and so they had some pretty wide open rate limiting controls, where Oasis was able to do things like extend windows during which the TOTP could actually be used, right? So those should be if you're going to use TOTPs, which you don't recommend, there should be a very short time period whereby that can be used. And essentially what I'm talking about with brute force attacks and rate limiting and blocking accounts is that if there is an automated attack like that, and essentially the TOTP, the user or whatever software they're using to actually perpetrate the attack is getting it wrong, which is what happens in a brute force attack. It's like we're just going to keep throwing codes at it until one just happens to match, like a dictionary attack. So what Microsoft did was they kind of closed the window by which this could still happen, but it's in all honesty, they basically just kind of shortened the time period by which this could happen and put some more controls on the rate limiting. But it's still something that they offer for step up.
Right. I think something that was very interesting to me was Basically because, as you said, they had this extended time window in which you could just keep trying. Apparently, the allowed rate gave the researchers a 3% chance of guessing the code correctly. And then after repeating this for 24 more times, about 70 minutes, they could pass it with a 50% chance, which is pretty good. So now the attacker doesn't even need to go phish the end user for that second factor code. They could just get their stolen credential and then just rapidly brute force the time bound code. Um, so, we talked a little bit about the vulnerability. Well, actually, we talked a lot about the vulnerabilities of TOTP. So, when it comes to defense, the guidelines I thought were fairly disappointing, right? It was enable MFA, like, yay, yeah, totally, absolutely
Right.
do that. And then, monitor leaked credentials and set up alerts. So what's your take on the recommendations? What should people do to actually protect themselves?
Yeah, this is where this is one of the things when we talk about at Beyond Identity doing everything as a secure by design motion. What do we actually mean by that, right? And part of that is just not allowing these weak form of credentials to actually be utilized. And this is what's problematic on a lot of our vendors or our competitors or partners part is that they still allow these things to be used, whether it's out of a matter of convenience or what users are kind of accustomed to. But what we really look to do is upgrade that and basically just cover those gaps where these particular credentials could be used. And to your point, this wasn't even something that required any form of social engineering. It didn't require the user to be fallible, which are things that can happen in these cases as well. This was basically just an automated tool, just throwing codes at, like you said, you get that initial credential, which is very easy to ascertain these days. And then you start throwing non-phishing resistant codes at it. And so the recommendation from our standpoint is very easy. Actually, it's to use a hardware-backed credential that is cryptographically bound to a device that has to be unlocked by something like an inherence factor. And
Mhm.
so this brute force attack would basically be something that just would not be effective in our scenario.
Yeah, no, I agree. Sometimes I think about it like putting, I don't have a good analogy, but if you presume the original sin, just to be dramatic, if the original sin is the password, right? It's weak, it's guessable. Then what we did as an industry was we said, oh, we need another factor on top. So then we layered things like
Right.
TOTP. And then we realized, oh, TOTP is not super secure because it turns out with time limits, with application delays, you could actually brute force that TOTP. So what we're going to do is we're going to layer additional defenses like a stricter rate limiting and alerting on top of that. And it's just, you're building um, you're building a castle on sand, right? Like the foundation is not secure, and it just feels like a lot of layers to kind of make up for this original sin that that credential to access your applications is insecure. And ultimately, um, we think that if your security relies on rate limiting and notifications, you've already failed the game. Those things are not infallible, as is demonstrated through this exploit. And the best way to move forward is to implement strong phishing-resistant device-bound credentials with no secrets and nothing to brute force. All right. Any last thoughts you'd want to add, Stephen, for our attentive audience?
Yeah, I just think that one of the things that is very important to us is to be proactive rather than reactive. So when we talk about things like notifications, yes, we're going to perform notifications, but to your point, it's sometimes too late, right? By the time you get a notification and are able to actually act upon it, the bad guys have already done their thing, right? So it's just something that, we make it a point to be proactive and not allow any weak points of control. It's like people fortify their front door with very strong locks, but then not put any locks on the windows type of thing, right?
Yeah.
Um, so it's something that we have to have a holistic approach and not have these gaps where we're going to allow these weak forms of authentication,
Mhm.
because people are going to find them, you know. Um, so I did want to talk a little bit, Jing, about what we can do about this for, let's say you're a Microsoft customer and you're concerned now, right?
Mhm.
So Microsoft has recently released a feature called external authentication methods. And what that does is allows vendors like ourselves who do perform strong authentication with preventing an attack like this to be the second factor of authentication. Um, and so they kind of open things up knowing that, some of these methods that, for example, got exploited here, are vulnerable to these type of attacks. And so if that's something you'd be interested in looking into, we'd be glad to talk about that.
Yeah, that's a good call out. I forgot to talk about Beyond Identity. Cardinal sin. Yeah, absolutely. We'll be back with more of these sort of debriefs on any notable exploits. We had some, prospects come and ask us about it, so we figured we'd just kind of have this conversation in the open and share it with you guys. And if you want more information, if you want a personal demo from Stephen, feel free to go to beyondidentity.com/get-demo. I think I got it right, but if you go to our website, it will be very obvious. All right, y'all. Well, thank you so much for chatting with us, Stephen. And until next time, bye.
Yeah, thanks everyone.